Now I want to tell you why I wrote this program. I wrote it for myself because I like to make a lot of online purchases. And I realized when preparing my state income tax return for 2018 that I was basically in the dark as to what my actual sales tax obligation was for the online purchases I'd made during the year. I'd noticed that when buying on Amazon or eBay, for example, sometimes the transaction would be taxed and sometimes it wouldn't. And the only way to try to accurately determine what, if anything, I owed in taxes would be to dig back through all my online purchases for the year and do a spreadsheet or whatever and come up with a number that I could justify if I ever had to. It seemed to me that it would make a lot more sense to record these things on the front end in a database so that at the end of the year you could simply push a button and run a report and see full detail of what your tax obligation was. And so that's really why I wrote it. And having thought about that and the value I find in the program, I thought maybe that others like you would find the same value in it. And let me give you another specific example of where tracking your sales tax obligation might be valuable to you. And I'm going to use the specific example of the state of California. In the state of California, residents are required to use a use tax worksheet to determine what, if any, sales tax obligation they have remaining to the state. Specifically, they must use this worksheet for certain purchases, which would be high-end purchases. For example, if they bought a television set out of state valued or that cost them $2,000, that would need to be itemized on this worksheet. And in addition to that, for most of the purchases you might make online or out of state, you don't need necessarily to use the worksheet. You have the option in California to look up your sales tax obligation from an estimated use tax lookup table. The tax obligation that you would have would be based on your adjusted gross income. So, for example, if you had high-ticket items that you had to track on a worksheet, in addition to routine items that you chose not to track on the worksheet, you do have the option to track everything on the worksheet, then you might be reporting your sales tax obligation from both those sources. And what bothers me about the estimated use tax lookup table is that I don't feel confident that the state of California isn't going to pad the tax obligation a little bit and make things work in their favor. In any case, it's very possible that in some years using the lookup table will benefit you, whereas in other years it won't because of your purchasing habits during that particular year. So I prefer to keep track of all purchases of this type, and then at the end of the year simply review a detailed report and choose the smart way to file at tax time. We're now ready to open the program and get into some instructional videos to show you how to use it. I'm going to open it. Click on the title label to get past the opening screen, which is meant to calm your nerves. And I'm going to log in a user so that we can see the complete screen with all its objects. But before we get into the specifics of using the program, I want to give you a little background, such as telling you who it's not for, who it's intended for, and the basics of how you're intended to use it. So, first of all, this program is not for businesses. This is not intended to be used by businesses to keep track of taxes. Who the program is for consumers like you and me, people who buy products, whether online, in retail stores in their own state, in retail stores out of state, or in private purchases in state or out of state. And let me back up one step and explain to you where this program will run. This program is designed to be run on Windows-based PCs and laptops. It's written in Microsoft's database program, Microsoft Access. It will not run on Apple machines. There is no cloud-based version. There is no mobile version. I do think that if you are one of those who runs Windows sandboxed on a Mac, the program should probably run fine. However, I have not tested that environment, so it is not guaranteed to run in that environment. Next, I want to describe how the program is intended to be used. The primary purpose of this program is to keep track of any state sales tax obligation that you may have at the end of the tax year to your state of residence. That is function number one. And the minimum of the transactions that you should enter into the database to keep track of your sales tax obligation would be online purchases, out-of-state retail purchases, and in-state or out-of-state private purchases. That is, purchases from private sellers. The secondary function of this program is to maintain home inventory. This could be valuable to you in the case of theft or loss through fire or natural disaster if you have homeowners insurance and you need to prove ownership of valuables that were lost. And we'll go into the specifics of that as we work with the program. And a third possible use of this program would be to track your sales taxes paid as well as other taxes, other expenses, whether taxable or non-taxable, such as medical expenses. If you're a person who itemizes deductions on your federal tax return. And we'll go into this in more specifics also as we work with the program. of course, when it comes to reporting sales tax on out-of-state retail purchases, we really are on the honor system because the state where you made the purchase is not going to be reporting those sales to your state of residence because you're not even declaring your state of residence when you make the purchase. But let me give you an example where if you hold yourself to the honor system, this could make a significant difference. Let me give you the example of a clothing purchase made in the state of New York by a resident of the state of Connecticut, and in particular a high-end purchase, although it would apply to all clothing purchases. Okay, to set the background, the state of Connecticut, your state of residence, has a general tax rate of 6.35%, but they also have a luxury item tax rate of 7.75% on various items like jewelry worth over $5,000 and any item of clothing worth over $1,000. Now, in the neighboring state of New York, the general tax rate is general sales tax rate is 4%, while clothing is exempt from sales tax if the value of the item is under $110. But suppose you drive over to the state of New York and you buy an item of clothing worth more than $1,000, you will be charged New York sales tax at 4%, while Connecticut will be expecting you to pay a use tax of the difference between their luxury rate of 7.75% and the 4% you were charged. So they'll expect you to pay 3.75% on the cost of that item. And of course, for private purchases, we are also on the honor system. But let me give you an example of a case where, according to your state's tax laws, you probably owe a use tax. Suppose you've got a buddy who sells you an expensive item like a used riding mower, which when new might cost $1,500, but he's going to sell you his used mower in great condition for $500. Well, technically, you should be declaring that at tax time and paying sales tax on the $500. In general, where we're on the honor system, it's going to be up to you whether or not you declare these things. I'm just pointing out the facts of life here. I also want to point out that I am not going to calculate taxes on major consumable items like groceries and fuel. In most states, these are not taxable anyway, and I'm going to assume that you consumed these items in the state in which you purchased them. I know that won't be true for all people. If you feel you're honor-bound to report your grocery purchases in a neighboring state because your state taxes groceries, I might ask you, why did you drive to the other state in the first place, if not to beat the taxes? However, in these cases, as in all cases, you are on the honor system, and the fact that I may not calculate a tax obligation for you does not absolve you from that tax obligation legally. I also want to point out that there are certain items for which I am not going to calculate a sales tax due, whether you purchase them in-state or out-of-state. Most importantly, this would be automobile purchases and boat purchases. The reason being that where you need to register these products in the state where you're going to be using them, the state is going to get you for whatever taxes they think are due. So I'm not going to try to keep track of those for you. If you don't want to include them in the program when you buy a vehicle, for example, that's fine because you're going to pay the tax. However, you might still want to include these things in your program if you are going to use it to maintain a home inventory, and or if you are going to use it to itemize deductions on your federal income tax. And we'll talk about these things in more detail as we get into the program. But for now, I'm going to wrap this up, and when next we meet, we'll look at some actual transactions, some entries into the program. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you soon in the next one.